Well, now that my Spinosaurus mirabilis is all done, it's time for some Middle-earth fun. So one could say the king under the mountain is now on the way. On this YouTube video today, I'll be making a dragon or wyvern skeleton, I say, and as I craft away, I'll be sharing some fun facts today on this fire-breathing dragon known as Smaug, I say. The one who happens to be both fire and death. Or the greatest of calamities, known as the King Under the Mountain. The tyrannical, terrible, and magnificent Smaug. And he is one of the three main antagonists from the movie The Hobbit, along with Azog and Sauron. But with that being said, we're going to be mainly focusing on Smaug, the fire drake from the Third Age. And he's considered to be one of the last dragons in existence in Middle-earth. While fire drakes were synonymous with dragons in Tolkien's universe, the writer himself described them as being more like giant scaled serpents, with wings in comparison to what we find familiar with dragons today. In The Hobbit, this foul beast was drawn towards the enormous wealth that the dwarves had under the Lonely Mountain, during the name of King Thrall, and laying waste to the neighboring city of Dale, before capturing the Lonely Mountain, and driving the surviving dwarves into exile. For 171 years, Smaug would hoard the treasure of the Lonely Mountain all to himself, choosing to stay in the comfort of the Dwarven Kingdom, until a company of dwarves managed to enter the Lonely Mountain along with Bilbo, and where they accidentally woke up Smaug from his hibernation, correctly assuming that the dwarves had received assistance from the men of Lake Town in their infiltration of the Lonely Mountain. Smaug then proceeded to leave his home and wreak havoc on Lake Town, nearly decimating it before being slain by Barb the Bowman, who would go on to be the founder and the first king of the new kingdom of Dale. Being a fully grown dragon, Smaug was both massive and powerful, possessing strength capable of crushing stone with incredible ease. He also had the ability to fly due to his large wings, and could breathe streams of searing hot flames from his mouth. Some comments in The Hobbit imply that his entire body was imbued in fire, as he was seen to glow in the darkness of the Lonely Mountain's depths, and his usual paths have been smoothed and slimed as a result of being melted by his fiery movements. His large size is shown to give him nearly uncalpable brute strength, more than suffice enough for him to break through the mountain. His armored scaly skin is shown to be nearly impenetrable, and his natural endurance for heat is demonstrated by being able to survive being submerged in molten gold. Despite his size, Smaug is also shown to be agile and quick, able to leap over large objects with ease, and can dive at high speeds with very little effort. And his senses are extremely acute. So much so that he was able to detect the sound and smell of a hobbit, even when the ring rendered Bilbo invisible to the naked eye. And it's also revealed that his roar from Erebor is powerful enough to be heard in Lake Town. And here's another bonus fact about Smaug's roar. The man who was responsible for making these sound effects for Smaug actually asked his daughter to roar like a dragon and ended up using her roar in the actual movie for the sound effect. And I also think it's kind of cool that a little girl is technically the voice or roar for Smaug. But Smaug is also known for his great intelligence, arguably as smart as any man, if not more so. And he was rather bilingual on the account that he could communicate to people and other numerous living creatures. Now visibly, Smaug is shown to glow red from within when he is about to unleash his fiery breath, with the same light emanating from his eyes, and only dimming at the moment of the dragon's death. Interestingly, the dragon also had an extensive knowledge of his treasure hoard, immediately registering the theft of a single cup after Bilbo made his first visit to his lair. His senses were so great, he managed to sense the one ring that was carried by Bilbo, describing it as something made of gold, but far more precious. When the hobbit returned a second time, Smaug was expecting him, so he pretended to stay asleep and mentioned that he could sense the thief even knowing he could not see him. Although Bilbo was smart enough not fall for Smaug's attempts to trick him into revealing his location. The dragon decided to then use the power of conversation to plant doubts into Bilbo's mind, correctly guessing that the hobbit had allied himself with the dwarves and the men of Lake Town, before asking Bilbo if he ever considered the logistical difficulties of getting his share of Smaug's treasure back to his home. Defensively, Smaug's reddish gold scales render him impervious to nearly all weapons. However, his underbelly was relatively soft and vulnerable. To compensate for this, Smaug took it upon himself to sleep upon the gathered treasure on the Lonely Mountain, allowing bits of gold and jewels to embed into his body. This diamond and golden shield was intended to cover his only weak spot. But when Bilbo confronted him in his lair, he saw a bare patch on the left side of his chest. This information was then passed on to Bard the Bowman by an ancient thrush, which was essentially a musical songbird, that overheard this conversation between Bilbo and Smaug, and then passed this information on to the dwarves. With respects to his personality, in both the film and novel adaptations, Smaug is portrayed as being psychopathic, extremely sadistic, confident, violent, cruel, arrogant, intelligent, and greedy, possessing an unquenchable desire for gold. His most distinguishing characteristic, aside from his greed, is his arrogance, as Smaug proudly boasts about his superiority and his impregnability towards Bilbo. During their encounter, however, this does prove to be his downfall, as he unwillingly reveals his weak spot to Bilbo, showing the hobbit how he willfully covered his underbelly in treasure to protect his vulnerable spot.
Do you now?
Unlike other dragons who have lived in Middle-earth and who have been bred by Morgoth during the First Age, were made to serve as gigantic shock troopers or mobile artillery, Smaug seems primarily motivated by personal greed, rather than a desire to do evil, and he didn't seem to serve any allegiance other than his own. Whilst he does ruthlessly destroy Dale and lays waste to the dwarves of the Lonely Mountain, during his attacks, once he assumed dominion over the region, he seemed pretty content to allow the rest of Middle-earth to go on about its business, just as long as him and his treasures remained undisturbed. Although this could have been because he felt that the people living in that region had nothing that he wanted. Details about Smaug's past are vague at best, but what we do know in the year 2772, the Third Age Firedrake had attacked the Lonely Mountain and the town of Dale, with many people believing that he was born in the Third Age, around the eastern edges of the Great Mountains, in the Middle-earth known as the Withered Heath. It's also worthy noting that Gandalf said that Smaug was not fully grown at the falls of Erebor and Dale. And while his age is difficult to pinpoint, we can make a rough assumption based on the description of other dragons throughout the history of Middle-earth and the period of time in which he was recorded. Now, given that Glaurung was the first fire-breathing dragon born in Middle-earth, was believed to be born in the year 155 of the First Age, before his first appearance in the year 260, living over 346 years before his death in the year 501 at the First Age, and considering that he was described as young and scarcely half-grown at the age of 105 when he began rampaging throughout Middle-earth, we can then surmise Smaug was born roughly a century before his attack on the Lonely Mountain, choosing to begin his reign of terror in his adolescent years. In the 171 years that followed, Smaug would develop into a reclusive adult, which meant by the time of his death, in the year 2940 of the Third Age, the dragon had lived to be roughly 270 years old, just 76 years shy of his forefather before him. There's also a passage from Smaug himself that alludes to his age, and how he developed into an adult whilst living in the Lonely Mountain. As seen with this quote, "The king under the mountain is dead. And where are his kin who dare seek revenge? Gideon, lord of Dale, is dead, and I've eaten his people like a wolf among sheep. And where are sons that dare approach me? I kill where I wish, and none dare resist. But then I was young and tender, but now I am old and strong. Thief in the shadows. My armor is like tenfold shields. My teeth are swords, my claws spears. The shock of my tail a thunderbolt. My wings a hurricane, and my breath death. For nearly 2 centuries, Smaug ruled the Lonely Mountain, uncontested, spending his days within the mountain, laying on top of his massive treasure hoard, which he guarded relentlessly. The surrounding domain became a scarred wasteland, known to the dwarves and men as the Desolation of Smaug. After Smaug had figured out the plan to bring him down, he flew into a rage, erupting from the mountain into a fiery wrath, loosening his flame upon the land. He then turned his fury upon Lake Town, and amidst all the havoc, Bard the Bowman, heir to the throne of Dale, did his best to rally the townsmen to repel the assault against the dragon. But their arrows could do very little against the dragon's armor. Then Bard, being informed by the dragon's weakness by our little songbird, then fired a black arrow right into the vulnerable spot on the dragon's underbelly. Smaug roars in fury and pain, and then fell from the sky, with his death marking the end of dragons in the Middle Earth. And that's going to be all we have for the information on Smaug today. And if you liked this video today, be sure to set that like button ablaze, I say. Comment below what you think of the project, and share with your friends, and perhaps consider subscribing if you're new, because there's plenty more dragon content coming for you. Now for a quick summary on the build rundown today, where one could say we made a wyvern skeleton today. Made from aluminum armature wire, tinfoil to help save on clay, and oven-baked clay for the bones, you might say. But be sure to stick around for part 2, I say, because that's when we'll be starting with the plasticine clay, I do say. Hello everyone, on part 2 of Smaug today, this dragon's becoming more than just a skeleton, I say, because I'm sculpting away with plasticine clay, I do say. A lot of things will be going on in this video, you might say, starting with some painting today, then we'll be touching up the skeleton, I do say, before adding the plasticine clay and the fabric wings, I say, while going over some fun facts today. Smaug is probably one of the most recognizable characters of all of fiction. Now, definitely one of the most recognizable dragons. Now, I do have my share of nitpicks about the movie The Hobbit, and trust me, but what I do not have is the design of Smaug.
Do you now?
He had the presence, the scheming intellect, and the arrogance that I was more familiar with from the Hobbit novel. But today I'll be talking about how Tolkien designed Smaug, or how he designed his dragons more generally throughout his novels, and which sources he exactly drew from, because the story about this is actually pretty interesting. Most people know that Tolkien was an avid reader and lover of mythology, notably Norse or Icelandic or Scandinavian-esque stories, and you definitely see these leak over into his novels, and Smaug is no exception. In Tom Chippy's book, JRR Tolkien, the author of the century, he wrote, and I quote, "For Tolkien's taste, there were far too little dragons in ancient literature. Indeed, by his count, only 3. The Midgardsome of Ragnarok, the dragon which Beowulf fights, and Fafnir, who was killed by the Norse hero Sigurd. Tolkien didn't feel that this first dragon, the Midgardsome, could fit into any real, down-to-earth story. So he drew more from the dragon from Beowulf, as well as Fafnir. Now, before I get too carried away with these crazy names I say, I'd like to apologize for any mispronunciations. I'm not exactly fluent in Scandinavian, so I'm not necessarily perhaps the best at pronouncing some of these names. So please forgive me. After all, I am just a little Canadian, eh? The marks of the epic saga Beowulf are immediately apparent in the story of The Hobbit. In the story of Beowulf, a slave steals a jeweled goblet from a dragon's hoard, causing the dragon to rage and destroy villages. And it is written as followed. There went inside a man, I know not which, and he groped near the heathen hoard, and his hands wrapped around a ornamental bauble. Tolkien references this exact scene when Bilbo first disturbs Smaug, and it goes as follows. He grasped a great two-handed cup, as heavy as he could carry, and cast one fearful eye upwards. Smaug stirred a wink, opened a claw, and the rumble of his snoring changed its note. And in the movie, you see a very similar thing happen. But there's one other moment that Tolkien was inspired by in the Beowulf saga. The death of the dragon. Despite the saga setting up Beowulf as the main character, with a drive to protect his people, it's not actually Beowulf who slays the dragon in the end. Instead, that honor goes to his friend, Wiglaf. In much the same fashion, Tolkien subverts our expectations by setting up Thorn as the main character, where he is driven to protect his people and wants to kill Smaug, but it's Barb who delivers the killing blow. But believe it or not, Tolkien was actually kind of disappointed with the dragon in the Beowulf saga, and felt like the character concept was just a little too simple. That it represented greed and the corrupting evil of avarice, but nothing really past that. Later he wrote in a letter to a fan, I find dragons are a fascinating product of our imagination, but I don't think the Beowulf one is frightfully good. Fafnir in the late Norse versions of the Sigurd story is bitter, and Smaug and his conversation is obviously ended there. While Tolkien clearly didn't aim for Smaug to have these attributes, avarice, arrogance, and ancient power, he wanted Smaug to have a bestial life and a thought of his own. So basically, that's what we got, was an intelligent and scheming dragon that could not only surpass the characters on a physical level, but an intellectual one as well. But as Tolkien himself said, he took inspiration from a dragon in Norse mythology called Fafnir. Much like Smaug, Fafnir was much more intellectual, and had his own desires and own personality. Interestingly, when Fafnir is confronted by Sigurd, there's a short scene in the saga of the two playing riddles, where Fafnir tries to guess Sigurd's name. And this is not unlike one of the very first scenes between Bilbo and Smaug, where Bilbo cryptically explains,
Who are you, and where do you come from? May I ask?
I come from under the hill.
Underhill.
Bilbo then goes to describe himself in weird and unusual ways. It's definitely a great part of the book and the movie, and it's a reflection on that part of the epic saga. When considering how dragons should be depicted, Tolkien in his mind at least explained that, I never imagined dragons were under the same order as the horse. And that's not solely because I saw horses daily, but even the footprint of a dragon, the dragon had the trademark of fairy written upon him. In whatever world he had his being, it was another world. To Tolkien, dragons epitomize the otherworldliness of fantasy. They had to be grand, they had to be majestic, almost like their being was beyond the reach of mortals. And this does really tie in well with Tolkien's depiction of dragons, not only in The Hobbit, but throughout the Silmarillion. They are these otherworldly creatures with mysterious powers that we don't necessarily understand and can affect the characters in unexpected ways. So in other words, they're basically not just mindless movie monsters. Tolkien thought a lot about dragons in early literature, and a piece that he wrote on Beowulf said, a dragon is no idle fantasy. Whatever may be his origins, in fact or invention, the dragon in legend is a potent creation of man's imagination, richer in significance than his barrel is in gold. Historically, there had been creatures that humanity had devised, any number of characteristics or attributes. In particular, greed, hence the hoards of gold, or selfishness or wickedness that a man must overcome in themselves or in the world around them. And we see these ideas of Tolkien's being represented in Smaug just as much as we do in his other dragons. We can juxtapose Smaug's greedy desire for gems and gold with Thorin's own lustful desire for the Arkenstone. And one could say it blinded them both and eventually led to their downfalls. And Thorin's famous last words were, of course, if more of us valued food, cheer, song above hoarded gold, the world would be a merrier place. And undoubtedly, Smaug's arrogance that we see in Bethnia is well known and well established. But that's going to do it for all the fun facts today on Smaug, I say. So be sure to like that like button on fire today. Just like Smaug the dragon would, you might say. Share with your dinosaur and movie monster loving friends. Comment below what you think of the dragon so far. I think this is going to be one of my biggest projects yet. And be sure to subscribe if you're new because there's plenty more monster content coming for you. Because soon part 3 of this dragon will be on the way, where I'm happy to say we'll be adding in all the little details I say. And then once this dragon's done, a new project will be on the way and or a animation will be stomping your way. But anyway, it's time for the build rundown today, I do say. So one could say this has been a very busy video today, because we started painting things off with the skull, I say. Then once that was done, it was on to some reinforcement fun, where basically I was adding some extra support to our dragon so he doesn't, well, fall on his face because he is quite large and is going to be very top heavy. Then once all the support was done, it was on to some fabric wing fun, which was fairly simple in retrospect. Basically, just took an old t-shirt, cut that up into, well, wing segments, and then used fabric glue to glue those onto the wings. Then once this dragon had the ability to fly, I slapped on the first layers of plasticine clay, I do say, but there's plenty more heading your way. On this video today, I'm happy to say we'll be finishing off Smaug the Magnificent, I say, and going over some dragon facts along the way, I do say. On this video today, we have a lot of work to do today because I'll be sculpting away at this dragon's details, I say, while going over how powerful the Middle-earth dragons are today. And the main question of the day is how powerful Smaug is, you might say, and how much of a difference he would have made if he survived through the War of the Ring. But just before I get into the lore, be sure to subscribe to Moose Motion Animation today, because if you enjoy dragons, dinosaurs, and monsters, there's plenty more content flying and stomping your way. So hit that subscribe button today, as the content creators like to say. In The Hobbit, Smaug is presented as Smaug the Great, the most powerful and formidable opponent in the scope of the story. And having gone through Tolkien's wider stories, I'm sure we can appreciate the powers in the wider world. The threat of the necromancer that Gandalf heads off to deal with, the Balrog or the other Maiar that may have given him a run for his money. But in an overall general census of the story itself, there's no doubt that Smaug has no equals. He single-handedly destroys an entire dwarf kingdom dug into the side of a mountain, as well as the thriving town of Dale, and is remembered a couple centuries later in awe and fear. None have even dared to approach the mountain since, let alone even challenge him despite the obvious massive hoards of gold he is lying on and being quiet for so long. Dale was abandoned and Lake Town was built to protect it from potential fiery dragon attacks. The desolation of Smaug was left desolate. No one was willing to challenge him. Even the indomitable King Thorin struggled to find people willing to go with him on the quest. Although perhaps his worth can also be seen by how he's remembered and the monikers that he is given, because Bilbo clearly tries to flatter Smaug in front of his face. Smaug the chiefest and greatest of calamities, Lord Smaug the impenetrable, and Smaug the mighty. But out of the dragon's earshot, the dwarves call him Smaug the dreadful. Tolkien's introduction references Smaug the Magnificent. He was clearly the epitome of awe for everyone. But yet, despite all this, Smaug was slain by a lone arrow shot. In the movies, there is quite the backstory to this, with a series of special black arrows, and a special bow, well, which is basically a ballista really. But in the book, it was just one special black arrow. aimed with precision at the one weak spot in the hollow of Smaug's left breast. There was a hint of serendipity or magic about this, because the black arrow had been passed down through generation to generation, and never failed to hit its mark and always seemed to be recovered, and was thought to be forged by the true king under the mountain, many centuries earlier. Its final use would allow the true new king under the mountain to return. So although this may seem just like a lucky shot, and Tolkien doesn't dwell on the mystical or fatal elements as to what happened, it would seem that it was not just luck, or even a good archer with a good bow, and someone with some inside information on Smaug's weaknesses that ultimately led to the demise of the great dragon. It was fated to be, and shouldn't undermine our understanding of Smaug's strengths. And his strengths were many, which he proudly boasted to Bilbo. To quote Smaug, "I kill where I wish, and none dare resist. I laid low warriors of old, and their like is not on this world today. Then I was but young and tender, but now I am old and strong, thief in the shadows." Smaug also gloated, "My armor is like 10-fold shields. My teeth are swords, my claws spears. The shock of my tail a thunderbolt, and my wings a hurricane, and my breath death. I am armored from above and below, with iron scales and hard gems. No blade can pierce me." Smaug was obviously bragging with these statements, but he was also not wrong. We briefly see him in action above Lake Town in the story, and clearly no conventional weapons can harm him. Lake Town is burnt and destroyed within a few fiery breaths, and a lash of his tail. He did have one weak spot, but if Bilbo hadn't spotted it, and the thrush hadn't heard Bilbo tell the dwarves about it, and then told Bard about it, and if Bard hadn't gotten that special arrow, nothing in Lake Town or in the surrounding area would have been able to stop Smaug. He really was that impressive, or magnificent. And it's not like Smaug is exactly a dumb, powerful animal. He is very intelligent and was able to read between the lines, that he was able to work out from Bilbo and figure out what was going on. The return of the dwarves, the involvement of Lake Town, and so on. His sense of smell was phenomenal, and the sense that he had that one cup was missing from his hoard is very impressive, and his voice and his eyes are said to have hypnotic powers. Now, how did he compare to the other impressive figures of this age? Well, we get an interesting perspective from the Unfinished Tales. In that, Gandalf talks about his reasons for supporting the quest of Erebor. Yes, he did want to help the dwarves reclaim their homeland, but he also had a bigger vision as well. Essentially, he was thinking ahead to the final confrontation with Sauron and what his dark plans might exactly be. To quote Gandalf, "I thought then, and surely now, that to attack Lordaeon and Rivendell, as soon as he was strong enough, was his original plan. It would have been a much better plan for him and much worse for us. You may think that Rivendell was out of his reach, but I did not think so. The state in the north was very bad. The kingdom under the mountain and the strong men of Dale were no more. To resist any force that Sauron might send, to regain the northern passes in the mountains, and the old lands of Angmar, there were only the dwarves of the Iron Hills, and behind them lay a desolation and a dragon. The dragon Sauron might use to terrible effect. Often I said to myself, I must find some way of dealing with Smaug. So essentially Gandalf thought that Smaug supported with Sauron's orcs could perhaps destroy Lothlorien and Rivendell. We saw orcs attack Lothlorien repeatedly in the War of the Ring, and fall repeatedly. Smaug could have been the difference. I would imagine that fire from above would be particularly effective against those woodland elves. So Gandalf was very happy to support Thorin in his attempt to take on Smaug. Eliminating Smaug and getting the dwarves back to the Lonely Mountain, and leaving the humans stress-free from dragon attack in that part of the world, would dramatically change the geopolitical situation. But Gandalf thought with Smaug just simply being alive or dead would be the difference in the Northern War of the Ring. But if Smaug was so powerful and strategically important, did Gandalf really think that Thorin and his small company could even defeat Smaug by themselves? That seemed rather unlikely. As a matter of fact, he said, I do not suppose that when we started, Thorin had no real hope of destroying Smaug. There was no hope. Yet, it happened. Gandalf wasn't exactly relying on the dwarves to be more powerful than Smaug, as they self-evidently were not, but in the hope that something eventually would turn up. But more accurately, he felt that if Bilbo went with them, that they would succeed, but if he didn't, they would not. And of course, he was right. Gandalf's ability to see the future even fuzzily is crucial so often in these stories. So Smaug was the preeminent force in that part of Middle-earth. He may have been a touchdown from the Maiar in terms of raw power, but it's clear that Sauron still treated Smaug differently, as opposed to other people on his side. Not someone he could necessarily dominate in order to do something, but rather someone who shared his vision and could be trusted more like an actual ally. Smaug was not on Sauron's side per se. They were more like natural allies, so less like the Nazgul and more like Shelob, for example. And Smaug was obviously the preeminent dragon for his age, and the last great dragon. Gandalf tells Frodo later, now that Smaug is gone, there were still dragons, but none that were so powerful. But before Smaug, there were many more dragons, and arguably far greater dragons. Perhaps I will do a video on those ones sometime. The first great dragon that was made by Morgoth was Glaurung. And he had no wings, but he could take on entire armies on his own. He ruled as a dragon king, and his magic was great, wiping people's memories and weaving magical lies. He features heavily in the tragedy of Children of Huron. Then we have Uncalegon the Black, known as the Great Dragon of Morgoth. His flames were hotter than all others. He could fly, and when he fell to his ruin, he crushed 3 mountains. We don't have exact measurements for any of those dragons, including Smaug, but it should be mentioned that Smaug is much smaller than these other dragons in comparison, while still being very huge. Tolkien admits that the cover that he drew for the Book of the Hobbit makes Bilbo look too big and Smaug far too small, because in the text for Smaug it mentions, he was vast and his wings were immeasurable, and he could eat 6 ponies in one sitting, which tells us how big his jaws and stomach were at the very least. But even so, he seems much smaller than Uncalegon. So overall, how powerful was Smaug? He was less than his forebears, and most certainly not the strongest of his type, but was the very last great dragon. And that makes him by a long way the most fearsome creature in that part of Middle-earth. Gandalf feared if he wanted to, he could destroy Lothlorien and Rivendell, and overcoming the magic rings of power held by Galadriel and Eldron. Sauron treated him as an ally, not a vessel, but the free people of Middle-earth dare not go near him. But he had one physical weakness, the one small hole in his underbelly. But in truth, his real weakness was his pride. He was clever enough to know that his underbelly was soft, and was clever enough to make himself a new sheet of armor out of precious stones pressed into his flesh over centuries of laying on his hoard. But it was his pride who made him show this off to Bilbo. Flattered by Bilbo's grand words, stunned by the accusation that he even had a weakness, he then showed off, and Bilbo saw the gap in the armor. Barb learned of it, and Smaug crashed to his death. Smaug was indeed powerful, very, very powerful as a matter of fact. But he is also a lesson in hubris. Pride comes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall, quite literally in Smaug's case. But that's gonna do it for all our fun facts on Smaug today. Hopefully you learned a hard lesson, you might say. But be sure to smash that like button today if you enjoyed this video, I say. And be sure to subscribe if you're new so you don't miss any of the new monsters coming for you. But at any rate, this project did take way longer than expected, so your support would be highly appreciated. This dragon approximately took about 3 weeks. And at this present sound recording, I'm now at clip 218, so I'm going to leave you all to enjoy the glamour shots. So I hope you all have a fantastic day, I do say. Hey, thanks for sticking around to the very end of the video. Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed the content, comment below what you think, share with your friends, and perhaps consider subscribing if you're new. Anyway, that's it from me. Till next time, take it easy.